Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. As I promised today, I really want to focus on the second part of the video, so I'm going to cover the situation on the front line just very briefly. First thing that we need to mention is something that I was silent about last time, but now certain parts have already been published online by other sources. Russians have been talking about this. And on the situation around the Kherson region, we have heard about Russians counterattacking in this area, and since then, Ukrainians were able to regain those positions. And since then, they were able to then move and advance both towards the east, towards Kazachilahiri, and also we know for sure that Ukrainians right now are significantly contesting the road that is going, the highway that is used by Russians. But this is not the only place where it is being contested. Another place where it is being contested is actually right over here. It's already also a complete gray zone, and Ukrainians are also making their way in this area. In this perspective, we can clearly say that Russians cannot quickly supply ammunition along the front line, at least safely. Therefore, we can say that Ukrainians are continuing securing their advances. The biggest problem that Ukrainians right now are reporting after they fought back against the Russian counterattack in this area is aviation. Aviation. Russians are flying a lot of aviation. They're using right now big aviation size cluster bombs so that they will have hundreds and hundreds of these bomblets that are just covering huge areas. Thankfully, Ukrainians are still holding, they're doing their job, but again, this is still a developing situation. You should be wary of looking too much into this. A little bit of an update around Avdiivka. Ukrainians are holding this position. Russians are slowly advancing, but this is unexpected. Again, I do not believe that there is positions on the front lines that cannot be taken. That's 100% cannot be taken. What I do believe is that it can require resources that are inadequate for the profits generated from taking that resources. Bakhmut is the best example because at the end of the day, Russia just got a lot of ruins of a city that didn't really give a lot of tactical or strategic advantage in the area. It's a little bit of a nightmare just thinking about how many Russians died. But Russians are trying to go on the offensive again. A little bit of a couple of days back. So what I was mentioning last time was that Russians moved their way towards Stepove. They were almost not completely entrenched in the cities. But since then, Ukrainians conducted a counterattack. It was semi-successful. Ukrainians did suffer significant losses. It's important to recognize that. But they were able to throw Russians back almost completely towards the railway. Since then, the latest reports is General of this direction, General Tarnavsky, has just reported today that Russians have started their offensive operations again towards Stepove and towards the chemical plant, and we don't know the details yet. We don't see any videos. Potentially, if that what General Tarnavsky has been saying is true, then we'll see videos in the coming days. So far, I have not seen confirmation of his claims, but he's a Ukrainian official, so I might as well tell you that. Then switching to a situation beyond map. Last time I was talking about how many Russian forces are operating in the north part of Ukraine with a breakdown how many armored vehicle tanks and yada yada Russians are having. And a couple of good questions came out. First one, could you explain how many troops are on Kherson and Avdiivka direction? And second was, could you also expand how many Russian troops and forces are right now in Ukraine? I was able to more or less compile my numbers. Best sources that I could get, I'm estimating what is the current situation with the Russian forces is as follows. Russia is having about 415,000 active fighting personnel in Ukraine. That includes all people that go to the front line to fight. It does not include people that are working to supply Russian forces, so you can add that number up a bit. Then we have about 2,300 tanks plus of what Russia is operating right now in Ukraine. With regards to armored fighting vehicles, it's over 5,500. With artillery, that is over 100 millimeter artillery, we're looking at 3,000 plus artillery pieces. It's important here to underline that Ukrainian command, on their official statistics, when they're counting artillery, they also counting heavy mortars in their calculations, which are 82 plus millimeters Russian mortars, whereas over 100 millimeters artillery, there's 3,000 plus. So you cannot just look at Ukrainian numbers of artillery destroyed and be the same. I just want to mention that. And with regards to rocket artillery, with like Grads or any other systems, we're looking at about 900 plus systems. So looking at these numbers, I want us to do a little bit of a reality check, because a lot of people live in a weird fantasy land where Ukraine has about the same resources as Russia, where Ukraine has already been supplied all the necessary firepower, and saying that Russia is about to collapse because Ukraine is to the same extent motorized and weaponized as Russia. No, you cannot say that. Just look at the numbers, and then even think about all of the deliveries that were made to Ukraine. These numbers are factual, after Russia has sustained significant losses. But Ukraine, if we're even talking about what Ukraine has received, it's maybe like 200-300 tanks. It doesn't matter how good the tanks are. It's still not the same number. It's not even in a ballpark, that number is. The same goes for artillery systems, the same goes for the armored fighting vehicles, and so on. We always need to understand that Ukraine is able to achieve parity with Russia only because their equipment is better, but they're having so much less to it. They're trying their hardest to apply it effectively, but it's just not to the same scale. So the resolution to this is to continue supplying Ukraine with weapons, and then it will go up and Russian artillery and weapons will go down. And second point that I want to make looking at these numbers is that you can clearly see the finite parts on these numbers. Russians are not able to even closely match the rate of extermination of every single part of this calculation. So we, looking at these numbers, need to be very aware that while Russian military is indeed huge, it is not endless. Whenever the Russian propagandist or any kind of Russian shill tells you, oh, Russia has just an infinite supply of tanks and armored fighting vehicles. No, they don't. No, they don't. It is finite. So while it is still a lot, remember, a lot of those are also being destroyed. Just in a bout of tanks, we're looking at some 200 tanks being disabled monthly. I'm going to take Russian propaganda number and say that Russia is rebuilding 100 tanks per month. Let's roll for this. It is still minus 100 tanks per month that Russia is losing. Another year of fighting, and this number is going to be well under 1,000. That's what I'm talking about. Even with their tempo of rebuilding, Russian army is ending. We need to recognize that, and that's why production powers of the Western forces is so important, and that's why it's so important to support Ukraine long term. Then the next topic that I want to cover is the North Korean shell. With North Korean shells, the numbers that were spread around was that North Korea has sent about 1 million shells to Russian forces. I don't agree with that number. I've looked at the methodology behind the number of 1 million North Korean shells, and it's essentially was there was a satellite pictures saying, oh, there was a certain number of cargo trains delivered from North Korea to Russia, and there was a snippet of couple of times the for how many trains there was. And people then calculated if every cart of that train would hold artillery shells, there would be this number of shells. If we then put this on timeline and said that the same thing happened every day for about a couple of months, then we can extrapolate that to about 1 million artillery shells. In my perspective, that is very huge stretch of a logic of calculation, and there is very little basis to believe that is indeed the case. But as a worst case scenario, it's possible to discuss it. In any case, we should consider this thing. There are now reports about how good the North Korean shells are. And as I instantly, when this news about North Korean shells being supplied to Russia appeared, I said that I will be very wary about how many of these shells are good or bad. Because with artillery, it's unfortunately, but you need to be very precise. The artillery barrels need to be quite precise. If they're not precise, then deviation of that artillery can vary wildly. But the same goes with your shell production. If shells that you've been producing for a while, and remember, we're not even talking about fresh North Korean shells. I'm pretty sure North Korea has sent some older stuff to Russia. If we're talking about these North Korean shells that were produced in questionable conditions, that were probably not held up to the certain standards that we have at NATO, these shells already proven that they have really bad deviation. A lot of these shells are also have been reported to be duds. And then there's also shells that are basically exploding barrels. Some people estimate that the faulty rate of the North Korean shells can be as close as 30 to 40%. It's a huge number, but Russia still got a lot of shells, so they're still firing them. We need to get, Russia still has a lot of stuff, 3,000 pieces of artillery. That's a lot of stuff. That's important every time I'm telling you about this. Keep the numbers in mind. So these North Korean shells are not as nearly as good as we estimate. And even if we take the number of 1 million, we can pretty much divide it by we can take a third of it and just say very solidly that this third is complete duds and they're going to be worse for Russians to use rather than being a benefit. Then some people were discussing that Bulgaria is going to send 100, I believe, BTRs 60s to Ukraine. And people were very laughing, saying, why are you sending such an old stuff to Ukraine? Guys, again, the numbers. We need to get to numbers. Right now, Ukraine is struggling because it does not have sufficient number to support their operations. It doesn't matter how old it is. Like it can be First World War stuff. You can fucking send horses. It's gonna be still usable for Ukrainian artillery, Ukrainian military. Anything works. If it's driving, if it's firing, if it's protecting at least somewhat the troops inside, it's worth it. That's why I am so mad very often that a lot of the stuff that is just standing on our Western backyards is not being sent to Ukraine because we're thinking, oh, maybe it's too old, or maybe it's too obsolete. It's not. Ukraine needs a lot of stuff. We have that stuff. A lot of that stuff is already being sent to scrap. Stop sending it to scrap, send it to Ukraine. They will find a use for it. And talking about a certain use for it, Russians right now are reporting on their propaganda channels that Armenia is sending Tochka-U missile launchers and missiles. They said a number about 200 of them to Ukraine. This is because rumors are because of Ukraine using Tochka-U missiles at certain points in recent time. And the truth is, I don't really believe this story. I feel that right now, Armenia is in a danger zone itself. Azerbaijan seems to be very committed to connect the two parts of Azerbaijan that are cut by Armenia. So Armenia is not in a safe zone as well. There is very little to benefit Armenia from sending these weapons right now to Ukraine that it might need in the nearest future. Therefore, I don't really believe the story. I think it's a propaganda narrative. More likely, I think that Ukrainians were able to reverse engineer whatever older decommissioned missiles they were having, and they were able to either restore them or find a way to kind of renew them and get them back into service. I believe that is a more likely explanation than Armenia suddenly sending the missiles to Russia. Then some of you wrote me and asked, can I comment on Putin's words about he's starting to negotiate, or it's like, stop listening to Putin. Turn that shit off. Stop listening to Russian propaganda. Enough. It doesn't benefit Ukraine. At the most, it doesn't benefit you. I made a good analogy for people said, like, how do I know good sources? Well, the problem with the sources is that you're living in information space. So once you consume information, you start diluting your perception. You know, that's why, for example, Russian tactics of white noise, creating like 10 different stories about a certain event, works so well. Because at some point, it's just too much for your brain to handle. So if you continue consuming shit information from shit sources, then your perception of the world starts getting diluted. You start questioning things. You start getting overloaded. Once you know that the source of information is shit, cut it out. Don't listen to it. Never open it. Never read about it. It's just bad. You need to be very, very, very careful with what you consume. And if you know what you're consuming is shit, you need to cut it out. Otherwise, at some point, you're going to start weirdly questioning, oh, maybe Putin is saying something here. Maybe I should ask Georgia about it. No. No. The only thing I want to hear from Putin is, I surrender, or once he's dying. Then the last part is completely opposite of that. Some of you are listening to the guys from the front line, which is great because there is information that only guys from the front line, the Ukrainians that are fighting the Russians, can tell you about. The problem is that you need to filter that information down. For guys at the front lines, there are no easy days. There are no easy tasks, especially if we're talking about the main direction of Russian attacks. It's always going to be bad. It's always going to be fight for survival. It's always going to be fight until death. It's going to be tragedy every day. It's going to be never enough weapons. It's going to be never enough firepower. It's never going to be warm enough, comfy enough. Everything is going to be always a problem. It's always going to be problematic command. That is just the nature of the frontline fighters. If they're not complaining, they're not doing their job. They're just pretending that they're at war. In all case, you need to take those information pieces that the frontline soldiers are giving you, but you need to step back and you need to always analyze the big picture if you want to think about where is this war going? Where are we going forward? Frontline information does not give you that wider perspective. That's why you have me that goes and listens to a lot of other sources, and I'm trying to condense this into a small, about 20-minute video that you can enjoy on your Thanksgivings. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do the YouTube stuff with liking and subscribing if you enjoyed it. Happy Thanksgivings to all of my American viewers. I love you all, guys. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time.